Your head is pounding. Your wound is infected. Your fever won't break. You have one option, and it involves mold, urine, and a very confident shaman. For most of human history, medicine wasn't a building you walked into. It was a relationship between your body, your environment, and the people who had spent decades watching both and some of what they discovered, by accident or by desperation, turns out to have been more effective than anything your great-grandparents could have bought at a pharmacy. This is the story of the weirdest, most surprising, and when you dig into the science, most brilliant medicines your ancestors ever used. Let's start somewhere uncomfortable. Urine. Before you dismiss this entirely, consider what urine actually is. It is not waste in the way we think of it. About 95% of it is water. The remaining 5% contains urea, a nitrogen compound your liver produces when it breaks down protein. And urea, it turns out, has antimicrobial properties. It draws water out of bacterial cells through osmosis, essentially dehydrating them. Ancient Egyptians used urine to clean wounds. So did the Romans. Roman soldiers reportedly washed their injuries with it on the battlefield when nothing else was available. Medieval physicians recommended it for everything from skin conditions to eye infections. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical documents, date to roughly 1550 BCE, reference urine as a treatment component multiple times. Was it perfect? No, but in a world before sterile bandages, before antiseptics, before germ theory, pouring a mildly antimicrobial liquid over a gash in your leg was not a bad call. Your ancestors were not being superstitious. They were being empirical. They observed that certain things worked. They kept doing those things. That is the entire basis of medicine. Now here is something that will make your next loaf of bread feel different. Bread mold, not Penicillium notatum. The exact mold Alexander Fleming famously identified in 1928 when he noticed it killing bacteria in his petri dish. But close relatives of it, growing on old bread and grain, had been applied to infected wounds for thousands of years before that. Archaeologist John Chadwick, working with linear B tablets from ancient Greece, documented early references to wound treatment with moldy material. Ancient Egyptians packed infected wounds with poultices made from moldy bread. Serbian folk healers did the same. Indigenous healers in Central America applied moldy plants to skin infections. These practices were happening across cultures, independently, with no communication between them. That is not coincidence. That is observation. Your ancestors noticed that infections treated with certain molds healed faster than those left untreated. They did not know why, but they were right. The mold was producing penicillin. Fleming did not discover penicillin. He confirmed what your ancestors already knew in practice. The next one requires a moment of adjustment. Willow bark. You may have heard this one, because it is perhaps the most famous example of ancient pharmacology that made it directly into modern medicine. But the full story is stranger and more precise than most people realize. The Sumerians recorded willow bark as a fever treatment over 4,000 years ago. Ancient Egyptians listed it in the Ebers Papyrus. Hippocrates, writing in the 5th century BCE, recommended chewing willow bark for pain and fever. Indigenous peoples across North America, including the Cherokee, Iroquois, and many Plains nations, independently developed the same remedy, boiling the inner bark into a tea. Why? Because willow bark contains salicin. Your body metabolizes salicin into salicylic acid. Salicylic acid reduces inflammation, lowers fever, and blocks pain signals. In 1897, Felix Hoffmann at Bayer chemically modified salicylic acid into a form that was gentler on the stomach. He called it acetylsalicylic acid. You call it aspirin. Every time you take aspirin for a headache, you are taking a pharmaceutical grade version of what a Neolithic healer handed someone 4,000 years ago. Let's go deeper into the past, much deeper. Neanderthals were burying their dead by at least 60,000 years ago at Shenidar Cave in what is now Iraq. Paleontologist Ralph Solecki excavated a burial site in the 1950s and found dense deposits of flower pollen surrounding the skeletal remains. The species identified, yarrow, groundsel, ephedra, and others were not random wildflowers. They were medicinal plants. Yarrow is anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial. Ephedra is a bronchodilator. It opens the airways. It is still used today in decongestants. The interpretation remains debated among archaeologists, but whether the plants were placed intentionally or not. The knowledge of what those plants did, documented across dozens of later cultures who used the exact same species, suggests something older was being passed down. Your ancestors may have been practicing botanical medicine before Homo sapiens even existed. Let's talk about maggots, because this one is exactly as strange as it sounds, and exactly as effective. Indigenous healers in Australia, the Americas, and parts of Africa used maggots, specifically blowfly larvae, to clean infected wounds. They would allow the larvae to feed on the necrotic tissue, the dead and infected flesh, without touching the healthy tissue beneath. The maggots secreted enzymes that dissolved the dead material. They also produced compounds that killed bacteria. This practice, dismissed as primitive superstition by European colonizers, is now called maggot debridement therapy. It is approved by the FDA. It is used in hospitals today, particularly for diabetic foot ulcers and wounds where antibiotics have failed. Surgeons in the modern era are doing what Aboriginal healers were doing for thousands of years before anyone wrote it down. The Aztec Pharmacopoeia, the system of medicinal knowledge developed by pre-Columbian civilizations in Mesoamerica, described over 1,200 plant remedies. When Spanish colonizers arrived in the 16th century, they were startled to find medical practices more systematic and more effective in some areas than what they had at home. Historian Francisco Guerra documented how Spanish physicians adopted several Aztec medicines and brought them back to Europe, where they circulated for decades. One of those remedies was a treatment using the bark of the copal tree for skin infections. When researchers analyzed copal resin in the 20th century, they found compounds with genuine antimicrobial properties. Here is the counterintuitive twist that changes how you see all of this. For most of human history, the biggest killers were not the diseases we usually imagine. They were infection, parasites, and childbirth complications. The people who survived long enough to reproduce were the ones living in communities with effective medicinal knowledge. That knowledge was not written down. It was held in the minds of specialists, healers, shamans, medicine women, herbalists, who spent their entire lives learning it. When European colonization wiped out those specialists through disease, forced conversion, and cultural destruction, it did not just erase people, it erased libraries. It erased pharmacopoeias that had been refined across hundreds of generations. Ethnobotanist Wade Davis, who spent decades documenting indigenous plant knowledge in the Amazons, estimated in his research that a significant percentage of modern pharmaceutical compounds were either directly derived from or chemically inspired by plants that indigenous healers had been using for centuries. The rainforest is not just a habitat. It is a pharmacy that your ancestors spent thousands of years learning to read them. And here is what all of this reflects back onto your life right now. You live in an era of molecular biology and precision medicine. You have access to antibiotics, antivirals, and vaccines that have extended human life expectancy by decades within a single century. And yet, the majority of the world's population still uses plant-based traditional medicine as its primary form of healthcare. Not out of ignorance, out of access. Cursed. And in some cases, because it works. The next time someone calls ancient medicine primitive, remember the moldy bread. Remember the willow bark. Remember the maggots. Remember that the people who used these things were not guessing. They were doing what humans do best, watching carefully, testing patiently, and passing down what actually worked. They did not have labs. They had something else, thousands of years. And no other choice, your head is still pounding. But now, you know exactly what your ancestors would have done about it. And the science agrees. They were not entirely wrong,